Hey friend, tonight we begin with the echoing hooves of a storm cloud of peoples, the Huns, and their terrifyingly effective leader, Attila. We're going to journey back to a world on the brink, a world where the seemingly unshakable order of the Roman Empire was about to meet a force it barely understood. So, before we get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy this kind of history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You find yourself standing on a windswept plateau, a place of tall, rustling grasses and an endless sky. It is the late 4th century, and the world, as you know it, is a very different place. For generations, the boundaries of power have been defined by the Roman Empire. Its legions, its cities, its vast network of roads and laws. It felt eternal. But on this step, that eternity is about to be challenged. From the east, across the great river systems and plains, come the first whispers. The whispers are carried by refugees, by displaced peoples. They speak of a new kind of terror, a terror of speed and silence, of the unerring accuracy of a composite bow. They call them the Huns. Now, historians debate the precise origins of the Huns, and the archaeological record offers frustratingly few certainties. Some scholars, looking east toward ancient Chinese accounts, have long linked them to the Xiongnu Confederation, a nomadic group that harassed the Han dynasty for centuries. Others argue this is a neat but unprovable narrative, suggesting the Huns were a distinct, multi-ethnic group that coalesced from various nomadic peoples. What we do know is that they appeared on the European scene with astonishing suddenness, crossing the Volga River around the year 370 CE. The people already living there, the Alans and the Ostrogoths, were simply swept aside. The stories that survive are a masterclass in fear-mongering. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, gives us a chilling, deeply prejudiced description. He tells you that the Huns were so induced to hardship, that they have no need of fire to cook their food, that they do not use plowshares, and that they live on horseback, day and night. He describes them as having almost no visible faces, just formless lumps. This, of course, is the perspective of a terrified, sedentary society observing a people whose entire culture revolved around motion and adaptability. They couldn't comprehend a life without fixed settlements, so they simply imagined a life without humanity. You watch as a group of these newcomers ride by. Their bows are short, elegant curves of wood, horn, and sinew, an engineering marvel that can launch an arrow with bone-shattering force. Their horses are small, tough, and tireless. The riders themselves are not the monstrous brutes of Roman propaganda. They are lean, with faces weathered by sun and wind. You can smell the scent of dried meat, of leather, and unwashed wool. They are not mindless savages, but masters of a different kind of warfare, a different way of life. They live in a world defined by the horizon, not by walls. Their wealth is not in land or buildings, but in their herds and the speed of their horses. Their power lies not in standing in a rigid shield wall, but in a feigned retreat that draws you in, only to unleash a volley of arrows from all sides. This, you begin to understand, is the core of their terror, not just their ferocity, but their utter unpredictability. The Romans had faced barbarians before, but these were different. These were not people seeking to settle down and farm. They were a force of nature, and the Roman Empire had no defense against the wind. Now, with the Huns established on the Roman frontier, the world's most powerful empire found itself in a rather awkward position. The Romans, ever so clever, had a go-to strategy for dealing with troublesome neighbors. they would offer to pay them. The Roman term for this was subsidies, which sounds so much more dignified than tribute or extortion. The Huns, for their part, were more than happy to accept this arrangement. After all, why fight for something you can get just by looking scary? It was a much more efficient use of everyone's time, really. It was in this environment, this complex and rather transactional relationship between two very different powers, that a young boy named Attila began to grow up. Historians have frustratingly few details about Attila's early life. We don't know the name of his mother, for example, and the primary sources are, as you might imagine, a bit thin on the ground when it comes to childhood anecdotes. But we can infer a great deal from the Hunnic way of life. We can imagine the world he was born into, the feel of the wind on his face as he learned to ride before he could walk, the rhythmic squeak of a leather saddle, and the taste of sour milk from a fermented mare's milk drink. He would have learned to shoot a bow with astonishing precision from a very young age, to hunt for food, to navigate by the stars, and to endure hardship without complaint. This was a brutal and practical education, a curriculum designed for survival on the steppe. He also would have been educated in a more formal sense, within the Hunnic court. This was not a humble, ragtag band of nomads. By the time Attila was a boy, the Huns had created a vast, complex empire, a collection of tribes and peoples all subordinate to the will of a central Khan. As the nephew of Rua, the powerful Hunnic king, young Attila would have been a witness to a masterclass in nomadic politics and diplomacy. He would have observed his uncle negotiating with Roman ambassadors, playing one half of the empire against the other, and managing the unruly chieftains of subject tribes. He even spent time as a hostage in the Roman court, a common practice at the time, which would have given him a front-row seat to the very civilization he would one day terrorize. This was not a mindless upbringing. It was a geopolitical apprenticeship. He was being groomed to lead. This brings us to the fascinating and often contradictory relationship between the Hunnic leadership and the two halves of the Roman Empire, the Western and Eastern. It was a relationship built on a foundation of fear and financial incentives. The Romans paid the Huns to not attack them, and also to serve as their mercenaries against other barbarian tribes. It was a strategy that was both brilliant and deeply cynical. As the historian Priscus of Panium noted, the Romans paid the Huns a yearly subsidy on account of their alliance, but also, more bluntly, to keep them from attacking. The scent of Roman gold and the sight of their silk-clad diplomats would have been a constant part of Attila's young life. He would have witnessed how easily a Roman official could be bought, or how a threat of violence was far more effective than a polite request. The Roman diplomat Flavius Aetius, who would later become Attila's great rival, played a key role in this early period. Aetius himself had spent time as a Hunnic hostage and spoke their language. He was a master of using Hunnic mercenaries to further his own ambitions and to suppress Roman rivals. He was a man who understood the Huns as a people, not as a monstrous caricature, and he knew how to use their power for his own gain. It's a fascinating and deeply ironic detail that the man who would one day fight Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains had once been his ally and, in a sense, his tutor in the complexities of Roman power. This tangled relationship, built on shared experience and mutual manipulation, sets the stage for everything that would come next. It's a story not just of a clash of civilizations, but of two remarkable men who understood each other all too well. In the year 434 CE, Attila and his older brother, Bleda, inherited the Hunnic Empire from their uncle, Rua. The sheer audacity of this joint rule is something to behold. The vast Hunnic dominion, stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the forests of Germany, was now under the command of two brothers. This was a fragile arrangement, a testament to the fact that power, especially in a nomadic empire, was personal. It was held not by institutions or laws, but by the charisma and military prowess of a single individual. For the next 10 years, the two brothers ruled together. The historical record is rather cagey about their dynamic, but we can assume it wasn't always a harmonious one. There's a persistent story, for instance, of a Hunnic warrior named Attila who was punished by Bleda and then pardoned by Attila, a clear sign of the rivalry that simmered beneath the surface. This uneasy partnership came to a sudden and brutal end. In 445 CE, according to primary sources like the Byzantine historian Priscus of Panium, Bleda died. The circumstances are, to put it mildly, debated. Some Roman sources claimed that Attila, with an almost theatrical lack of subtlety, simply murdered his brother to seize sole power. Other accounts suggest that Bleda's death was a hunting accident, perhaps a bit too convenient to be true. Given the lack of a modern coroner's report, we're left to wonder. What is certain, however, is that within a year of Bleda's death, Attila was the undisputed king of the Huns. He had consolidated power, eliminated his one major rival, and was now a singular force, unburdened by the need to share glory or authority. His reign as the sole ruler had begun, and the world would soon feel its full weight, with Bleda gone. Attila turned his attention to his most profitable and predictable source of wealth, the Eastern Roman Empire. For years, the Romans had been trying to reduce the tribute payments, a deeply insulting move from Attila's perspective. In his eyes, the Romans were not just reneging on a deal, they were challenging his authority. And that, as we've seen, was a very dangerous thing to do. So, in 447 CE, Attila launched what would become known as the Great Hunnic War. This was not a small-scale raid. It was a total war, a campaign of systematic destruction designed to bring the Romans to their knees. The Roman historian Marcellinus comes chillingly describe the devastation. The whole of Thrace, Moesia, and Illyricum was laid waste, and more than 70 cities were captured. Imagine the sounds of this invasion. Not just the thunder of hooves, but the terrible silence that followed. The screams of burning villages, the terrible clang of iron on iron, and then the slow, agonizing silence of a world picked clean. Attila's tactics were not just about conquest. They were about psychological warfare. He would approach a city, demand its surrender, and if they refused, he would lay siege with a terrifying new weapon, the Hunnic siege engine. These were not the massive, lumbering Roman machines, but smaller, faster, and more adaptable devices, a reflection of the Hunnic emphasis on speed and efficiency. The campaign was a masterclass in swift, overwhelming force. The Byzantine generalissimo, Arnagisclus, a man who had faced the Huns many times before, was finally defeated and killed in battle. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had for so long believed its walls and gold could buy peace, found itself exposed and vulnerable. This war had a domino effect, a ripple of fear that spread all the way to Constantinople. The city's inhabitants were gripped by a sense of impending doom. The emperor, Theodosius II, had no choice but to sue for peace, and what a peace it was. The terms of the treaty were humiliating. The Roman tribute payment was tripled, and the Romans had to pay a massive lump sum for the privilege of being defeated. It was a clear declaration that the balance of power had shifted. Attila was no longer a regional chieftain to be placated. He was the master of Europe. The great Roman Empire, with all its power and pride, was now little more than a tributary state. It was a shocking moment in history, a clear sign that a new, more brutal era had begun. And the most interesting thing? We have a detailed description of what it was like to be at the heart of this new empire. But that, my friends, is a story for our next installment. To understand Attila, we need to go beyond Roman propaganda. We need to hear from someone who actually met him. That's where we turn to the remarkable primary source of Priscus of Panium. In 449 CE, Priscus was part of a Roman embassy sent to Attila's court. This was not a formal, well-appointed Roman camp, but a vast nomadic encampment somewhere in modern-day Hungary. Priscus's account is a priceless snapshot of a world that was utterly alien to a Roman diplomat. He describes a scene that is both grand and surprisingly rustic. The Hunnic court wasn't a marble palace. It was a sprawling collection of wooden houses and tents. The air would have smelled of wood smoke, horses, and cooking meat. When the Romans arrived, they were immediately struck by the sheer chaos and scale of it all. They saw Hunnic nobles, and also the chieftains of various subject tribes, all paying homage to Attila. Priscus describes the king's own house as a large building of polished planks, not unlike a great hall. And inside, the atmosphere was, well, lively. Attila himself was a fascinating study in contradictions. Priscus describes him as short of stature, with a broad chest and a large head. His eyes were small, his beard thin and sprinkled with gray. He was not the giant monster of Roman legend. He was, in fact, rather unassuming. But his presence was anything but. During a feast held in honor of the Roman guests, Priscus noted a stark contrast. While the Huns and their allies were feasting on lavish foods, Attila himself ate from a wooden plate and drank from a wooden cup, a deliberate choice that communicated his focus wasn't on luxury, but on power and military might. He was an embodiment of the Hunnic ideal, practical, unpretentious, and utterly in control. The feast itself was a riot of noise and celebration, with singers and jesters performing. But Attila, Priscus observed, remained with the same calm and unchanged expression. The man rarely laughed. His humor, if he had any, was dry as dust. He simply sat and watched, a silent and unblinking eye at the center of the storm. While Attila was consolidating his power and terrifying the Eastern Roman Empire, a strange and utterly scandalous episode was unfolding in the West. The key player was a woman named Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Honoria was a bit of a handful, to put it mildly. She was rebellious, ambitious, and deeply frustrated by her brother's refusal to grant her any real power. So, in a fit of pique and desperation, she did something truly astonishing. Sometime in 450 CE, she sent a messenger to Attila's court with a ring and a plea for help. The messenger's note, as interpreted by the Huns, was a marriage proposal. This was, from Attila's perspective, a golden ticket. He could now claim a portion of the Western Roman Empire's territory as a dowry. He immediately demanded that Honoria be handed over, along with half of the Western Empire's territory. Emperor Valentinian III was, to put it mildly, horrified. He immediately dismissed the request and had his sister shipped off to Constantinople to be dealt with. But the damage was done. The Hunnic king now had his pretext, a fabricated casus belli, to invade the Western Roman Empire. Historians debate whether Honoria's plea was a genuine marriage proposal or simply a desperate cry for political help. The Roman court certainly interpreted it as the former, and they were mortified by it. Whatever her true intentions, this small, reckless act by a forgotten Roman princess provided the legal and political justification for Attila's next great campaign. It was an astonishing turn of events, a private family feud that would soon ignite a continent. And the fuse was lit. With the pretext of Honoria's dowry in hand, Attila began to gather his forces. This wasn't a Hunnic army anymore. It was a multinational, multi-ethnic war machine. From the vast plains of his empire came the thundering hooves of his Huns. but they were joined by the fierce warriors of the Gepids, the Ostrogoths, the Rugians, the Scythians, and various other subject peoples. It was a terrifying coalition, a human tidal wave moving with a single, destructive purpose. The sight of this gathering must have been something to behold. A sea of different tribal banners, the glint of countless weapons, the clamor of a dozen different languages, all united under one man. The air would have been thick with the smell of anticipation and fear, a tension that could be felt across the Roman frontier. The target was Gaul, modern-day France, which was the beating heart of Roman power in the West. As the news of Attila's march spread, a profound sense of panic set in. Roman officials, from Gaul to Italy, scrambled to prepare for the inevitable. But the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, a hollowed-out carcass of its own glory. Its legions were thin, and its resources were stretched to the breaking point. The Romans were in no position to face Attila alone. So, they did what they had to do. They sought a truce with their greatest rivals, the Visigoths. These were the very people who had sacked Rome 40 years earlier and had since established a kingdom in Gaul. The Visigothic king, Theodoric I, was initially hesitant, but his great enemy, the Roman general Flavius Aetius, that very same Roman general who had once been a Hunnic hostage and who knew Attila personally, was a master diplomat. Aetius argued that they were not just fighting for Roman survival, but for the very soul of the European world. He convinced Theodoric that the common enemy was far more dangerous than their old squabbles. The old rivalry was set aside, and a desperate, temporary alliance was forged. The two armies finally met in the late spring of 451 CE on a vast, flat plain in northern Gaul, a place that would forever be known as the Catalonian Plains. The numbers involved are mind-boggling and highly debated by historians. The Roman and Visigothic sources, naturally, claim that Attila's army was impossibly vast. What is certain is that this was a clash on an unprecedented scale. Imagine the sound of it. Not a formal, neat battle with two opposing lines, but a sprawling, chaotic melee. The air would have been thick with dust and the groans of men, the clatter of 100,000 weapons, and the high, terrifying shriek of the Huns' composite bows. The battle was a brutal, all-day affair. The center of the Hunnic line was pushed back, but Attila's forces were far from broken. The fighting was so fierce that Roman sources claimed the bodies of the dead formed a dam, creating a river of blood. Historians debate the veracity of such a claim, but it gives a sense of the sheer, unadulterated brutality of the conflict. The Visigothic king, Theodoric I, was killed in the chaos, a devastating blow to the alliance. But despite this loss, the Visigothic forces, led by his son, Thorismund, fought on. When the sun finally set, both sides were exhausted, and the field was littered with tens of thousands of dead. The next day, Attila remained within his camp, refusing to fight. The Romans and Visigoths, having suffered grievous losses, also chose not to press the attack. The Visigothic leader, Thorismund, decided to leave the field, either to secure his claim to his father's throne or to simply abandon the messy alliance with the Romans. Whatever the reason, Attila's army was left intact. Aetius, knowing that he couldn't face Attila alone, also retreated. So, who won? That is the great debate. The Romans claimed it as a magnificent victory, a last-ditch stand that saved Western civilization. And while it did halt Attila's advance into Gaul, it was far from a decisive triumph. Attila's forces were not destroyed. They were merely delayed. He had been stopped, but not beaten. He was a cornered animal, and he was still a very, very dangerous one. He would spend the next year licking his wounds. But then he would turn his gaze from the fields of Gaul to a new, and even more tempting target, the very heart of the Roman Empire. Italy itself. After the bloody stalemate on the Catalonian plains, Attila spent the winter regrouping. The spring of 452 CE brought an even greater horror for the Western Roman Empire. Having been unable to conquer Gaul, Attila turned his army south and invaded Italy. He bypassed Rome itself, perhaps for strategic reasons, and instead unleashed his fury on the wealthy cities of the north. His first target was the prosperous city of Aquileia, a major Roman trading hub. The city's inhabitants were defiant, and the siege lasted for months. When the city finally fell, Attila's vengeance was swift and total. Primary sources report that the city was so thoroughly razed that later generations had trouble even identifying where it once stood. The archaeological record suggests a brutal and comprehensive destruction. The invasion was not just a military campaign. It was a psychological one. The terror of Attila's army spread like a wildfire, causing cities to be abandoned before he even arrived. Citizens fled their homes, their possessions, and their lives, seeking refuge in the lagoons and marshes of the Adriatic coast. It was in these wetlands that a small group of refugees would eventually found a city that would one day become Venice. From Aquileia, the Hunnic army swept through the north of Italy, sacking city after city. They burned Vicenza, Verona, and Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, where Attila took a moment to admire a portrait of the Roman emperors. In a moment of classic, tongue-in-cheek humor, Attila demanded the artist paint him on the throne with the Roman emperors prostrate at his feet. The artist, wisely, complied. And so, we arrive at one of the most famous and perplexing moments in all of ancient history. Attila was on the march toward Rome, the eternal city itself, when an embassy met him outside the walls. It was led by the venerable Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo I. The details of this meeting, preserved in a few tantalizing accounts, are sparse. What we know is that after meeting with the Pope and two high-ranking Roman senators, Attila turned his army around and retreated. He did not sack Rome. This was a stunning and unprecedented turn of events. For centuries, Christian historians have attributed this retreat to a miracle. They claim that the Pope's powerful plea, backed by divine intervention, convinced Attila to spare the city. And while a deeply compelling story, historians offer a number of more practical and, frankly, more likely reasons for the retreat. The Hunnic army had been marching and fighting for a long time. Their supplies were likely running low. More importantly, a terrible plague, an invisible enemy far more deadly than a Roman legion, was sweeping through Italy, and it had begun to afflict Attila's troops. Furthermore, the Eastern Roman Emperor, Marcian, had sent a new army to raid the Hunnic homeland, forcing Attila to consider the security of his own territory. When you combine all these factors, the diplomatic offer of a new Roman tribute payment, the threat of disease, a lack of food, and the need to protect his own empire, Attila's retreat makes a great deal of sense. Perhaps the Pope's eloquent words were the final nudge, but the stage was already set for a hasty departure. Attila returned to his camp in Hungary, the conqueror of two empires, master of a vast realm, and the wealthiest man in the known world. His next move was to marry a new wife, a Germanic woman named Ildiko. On his wedding night, after a night of feasting and celebration, Attila retired to his bed. The next morning, he was found dead. The accounts are, again, a little murky. The most widely accepted version is that he died of a nosebleed. According to the Roman chronicler Jordanes, Attila, in a drunken stupor, simply bled out from a massive hemorrhage. It was a bizarre, anticlimactic, and rather pathetic end for the scourge of God. The myths, of course, tell a different story. Later legends claim that he was poisoned by his new wife. or that his body was secretly disposed of to prevent it from being desecrated. The primary sources, however, suggest a simpler and more mundane tragedy. The man who had brought two empires to their knees was undone not by a hero's sword, but by a simple, internal weakness. His funeral was a grand and sorrowful affair, an event that highlighted the immense personal power of the man who had just passed. Attila was buried in a triple coffin of gold, silver, and iron, a fitting tribute to his wealth and power. To this day, his grave remains undiscovered, a testament to the care his loyal subjects took to ensure his final resting place would never be disturbed. For years, the Hunnic Empire had been held together by one thing and one thing alone: Attila's singular will. He was the sun around which all the other peoples of his empire orbited. The moment he died, his vast dominion was plunged into chaos. The story of his empire's collapse is swift and brutal. Within a year, Attila's sons were fighting over control of their father's kingdom, and the subject tribes, seeing their chance, began to rebel. The Gepids, the Ostrogoths, and the other Germanic peoples who had been forced to serve Attila rose up against their Hunnic overlords. The rebellion was successful, and a great civil war erupted, one that would see the Hunnic Empire simply disappear from the pages of history. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. The empire that had been built on conquest and fear was now undone by the very peoples it had conquered. The Huns themselves would eventually be absorbed into other nomadic groups, their distinctive culture fading into history. Their great empire, which had terrified the Roman world for over 80 years, was no more. Attila had not built a sustainable political system. He had built a temporary, personal kingdom. The great Roman Empire, for all its faults, was an institution. The Hunnic Empire, for all its power, was simply a man. And now, my friends, we have come to the end of our journey. We have followed the echoes of those thunderous hooves, from the whispers of the steppe to the final, silent stillness of an unplumbed grave. Attila's legacy, as we've seen, is not in the cities he built or the laws he laid down. His legacy is in the myths, the fear, and the sheer, unadulterated shock he inspired. To the Romans, he was a force of nature, a deserved punishment from God himself. To the Hungarians, he is a national hero, a symbol of their nomadic and warrior past. But perhaps his truest legacy lies in the quiet spaces, in the things he inadvertently created. Those refugees who fled the destruction of Aquileia built a city of canals and islands. They built Venice. His campaigns forced the Romans and Visigoths to come together, however briefly, against a common foe. And his relentless pressure on the Roman frontier hastened the end of the Western Empire itself. And so, we leave him here, a man who rarely smiled, a man who united an empire through sheer force of will, a man who changed the course of European history. Let the wind carry the final grains of dust from the plains where he rode. The world he terrorized is now a world that can, with the gentle hum of an electric fan, feel a little safer. The sounds of battle have faded into the deep, deep past. All that remains is the sound of our own breathing, slow and steady. You find yourself stirring from a deep sleep, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke, old wool, and the faint, earthy aroma of the livestock kept at the far end of the longhouse. The low morning light filters through a gap in the roof, illuminating a shaft of dust motes dancing in the stillness. A soft, steady drip from a melting icicle on the roof above is the only sound besides the rhythmic breathing of your family, all tucked into their sleeping benches along the walls. Your fingers trace the coarse texture of the woven blanket, a familiar warmth against the chill of the earthen floor below. This is your home, a single, long hall that serves as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop all at once. And it is your domain. As the hearth embers glow to life, you rise, careful not to wake the children still nestled in their furs. The cool morning air raises goosebumps on your skin, but the work of the day is already calling. You make your way to the central fire, where a large iron pot hangs, a constant source of warmth and food. The smells of last night's stew still linger, a blend of root vegetables and smoked meat. It's your responsibility to maintain the fire, a symbolic and practical act that speaks to your role. As historians and archaeologists have long noted, the mistress of the house, or Husfrija, was the one who held the keys to the household's provisions, and this was not a symbolic role. It was a position of immense power. It meant that you controlled the very survival of your family. The keys you will soon fasten to your belt are the physical manifestation of this authority, opening not just chests and doors, but also signifying your command over the food, the tools, and the very structure of daily life. The archaeological record, particularly from graves, supports this view. A woman's burial often included her keys, spindle whorls for spinning thread, and loom weights for weaving. These weren't just personal possessions. They were the tools of her trade, a testament to her crucial economic and social role. While the men might leave for months or even years on raiding or trading expeditions, it was you, the woman, who was left to manage everything. The farm, the livestock, the finances, the children, all of it fell under your purview. This dual responsibility, managing the present and preparing for a future that might not include your husband's return, created a society where women were, out of sheer necessity, powerful and highly respected. This isn't just a romantic notion from the sagas. It's a conclusion drawn from the physical evidence we have dug out of the earth. The very layout of the longhouse, with the central hearth as its beating heart and the woman as its keeper, illustrates this foundational truth. You are not simply waiting for a man to return. You are the one who ensures there is a home for him to return to. The rhythm of your day is the rhythm of survival itself. You stretch, feeling the familiar ache in your shoulders from a day of endless tasks, and reach for your clothes. The underdress of linen is cool against your skin, and over it, you pull the heavy woolen shift. You fasten it at the shoulders with two large, ornate brooches, the tortoise brooches that are a woman's signature adornment. These aren't just for decoration. They are the fasteners that hold your entire outer garment in place, a practical piece of metalwork that tells a story. From them, you suspend various chains, and from one of these chains, the key hangs, the key to the food chests and the household stores. It's heavy and cool to the touch, and you can feel its weight as a constant, reassuring presence. It's a physical manifestation of your authority, a detail confirmed time and again in graves of high-status women from places like Birka in Sweden and Koppang in Norway. The brooches themselves, often found in pairs, are works of art, some of them so intricate they must have been the work of master craftspeople. These beautiful objects serve as tangible evidence of a woman's wealth and status, and their widespread use suggests a cultural uniformity in how a woman's role was visually represented. As you move through the longhouse, the morning light reveals the various tools of your trade. A small knife, a whetstone, and a comb are all tied to your belt, each with its purpose. The comb, in particular, is a reminder of your duty to maintain a certain level of hygiene and appearance, even in this rustic environment. The knife is for everything from cutting twine to preparing food. Each item is a piece of your daily uniform, telling the story of a life lived through hands-on work and careful management. Your gaze falls upon the chests, intricately carved and bound with iron bands, and you know what they hold. Not just clothes and linens, but also the small, valuable items that a household depends on. spices, medicines, even silver or trading goods acquired from a visiting merchant. It is a subtle but profound statement of trust that these things are under your direct control. There's a small, soft scraping sound, and you see your youngest daughter, her eyes still half closed, pushing a small toy horse along the earthen floor. You smile and continue with your work, aware that you are not just managing a home, but also teaching the next generation. She will learn by watching you. She will see the respect you are given and understand that her future status and power are directly linked to her ability to run a household with competence and wisdom. The saga literature, though written centuries later, often alludes to this. The strong, capable Husfrija is a recurring character, and while we must be careful not to take literary descriptions as literal fact, they do reflect a cultural ideal. These women were not passive ornaments. They were administrators, managers, and problem solvers. The stories and the graves are in agreement on this point. You reach for a wooden bowl and begin to mix some grain with water, preparing the first meal of the day. The simple act of grinding and mixing is a ritual you have performed thousands of times, a quiet meditation on the constancy of life. You are the center, the axis around which the household spins. The men may come and go, with tales of sea battles and distant lands, but it is your labor that anchors the entire family to the earth. Without the keeper of the keys, without the manager of the larder, the adventurers would have no safe harbor to return to. The ship might be the vessel of conquest, but the home, the longhouse, is the vessel of survival. The rhythmic slap of the loom's sword against the warped threads is a sound you know intimately. It's a percussive beat that echoes through the longhouse for hours, day after day, week after week. As you sit at the vertical loom, its heavy wooden frame a constant presence in the main room, you feel the smooth, oiled wood in your hands and the slight pull of the threads as you work the weft. This isn't just a chore. It's a craft of immense skill and economic significance. The textile you are weaving is a heavy woolen cloth, a vie with a qteme with a qtel, which serves as the most important form of currency in the Norse world. It can be used to pay for goods and services, to pay fines, or to trade for exotic items from distant lands. So, when you work the loom, you are quite literally creating wealth. This detail is supported by the sagas, which frequently mention cloth as a measure of value, and even more so by the abundant archaeological evidence. We find loom weights, the stones that kept the threads taut, in almost every archaeological dig of a Norse settlement. Their ubiquitous presence tells us that textile production was a core activity of the household, a truth that historians now widely accept. The work is communal, too. You are not alone. Your daughters, if they are old enough, sit beside you, learning the intricacies of the patterns and the rhythm of the work. You might also have a thrall, a slave acquired through trade or raid, working alongside you. While we tend to think of the male-dominated world of raiding and battle when we imagine the Vikings, it's important to remember that much of the labor, particularly the repetitive, skilled labor like textile production, fell to the women. The sound of the loom is a gentle reminder of this constant activity. It's the sound of an economy in full swing, and you are its engine. Your hands, calloused and strong, are turning raw wool into the lifeblood of your family's prosperity. The process is long and laborious, beginning long before you even sit at the loom. You remember the weeks spent carding and spinning the raw wool. The spindle whorl, a small, heavy disc of stone or clay, spun tirelessly in your hands as you drew out the fibers into a fine, consistent thread. This was a task you could do anywhere, at any time, while watching the children, while listening to a storyteller, or while sharing news with a neighbor. This continuous, low-level effort contrasts with the more focused, high-intensity work of weaving. Historians debate whether the textiles produced were just for the family's use or for wider trade. But the sheer quantity of loom weights and spindle whorls found suggests that production was often on a scale larger than what a single household would require. This implies that women were not just creating clothes, but were active participants in a vast, interconnected economic system. And what a system it was! While the men were off trading for silks from Byzantium or silver from the Caliphate, you were creating the foundation of the very wealth they were using to acquire these goods. The luxury items might have had the exotic flair, but the homespun wool was the constant, dependable currency that held it all together. There's a subtle humor in this, a quiet acknowledgement of the behind-the-scenes work that makes everything else possible. The legendary adventures and voyages were all built upon a foundation of domestic labor, spun and woven into existence by women's hands. As you work, your mind drifts, imagining the journey of the cloth you are creating. Will it be traded for a fine sword? Will it be used to buy a piece of land? The possibilities are as endless as the threads in your hands. And you are the master of them all. While textile production might have been your main indoor task, the most daunting and all-encompassing of your responsibilities was the management of the farm itself. You walk outside, and the cold morning air bites at your cheeks, a stark contrast to the smoky warmth of the longhouse. The yard is a hive of activity, even at this early hour. The sounds of a distant rooster crowing and the lowing of cattle mingle with the crackle of fire and the shouts of children. This farm, this Garther or BYR, is a living, breathing entity, and you are its heart. Every living thing on it, from the plumpest hog to the smallest thrall, falls under your jurisdiction. The men may have taken the name Viking from their raiding and trading journeys, but the word for a farmer, a bondi, was equally, if not more, important, and a husfrija was the master of that farm's daily survival. Your first task is to assess the larder. You head to the root cellar, a dark, cool space that smells of earth and fermenting vegetables. You run your hands over the hardened crocks of salted butter, the wheels of dense cheese, and the hanging, cured meats. Each of these items represents a season of hard, back-breaking work and a crucial defense against the long, hungry winter. Food preservation was an art form in itself, a constant battle against spoilage. You remember the endless summer days spent salting meat from the hunt, drying fish on racks, and fermenting milk into skyr, a thick, sour yogurt that provided vital protein. You might have also dried wild herbs and berries, using the heat of the hearth or the sun to preserve them for medicinal use or to add flavor to a stew. This wasn't just cooking. It was a complex system of chemistry and ecology that you, as the mistress of the house, had to master. Next, you move to the livestock. The animals are a source of warmth in the winter and a source of food and wealth all year round. The cattle, goats, and sheep need to be milked, and the dairy products, butter, cheese, and buttermilk, are a major part of the Viking diet and a valuable commodity for trade. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence of these practices in the form of wooden milk pails and churning tools. While men might have been responsible for the field work, plowing, and harvesting, women were typically in charge of the daily, year-round management of the animals. This gendered division of labor was not a sign of inferiority, but of specialization. Each gender had its own realm of expertise, and one was no less vital than the other. The sagas, for all their poetic flair, often reflect this reality. They show us women like Orjga, Idi the deep-minded, who, upon being widowed, became a great chieftain, managing her estates and leading her followers to new lands. While Aud's story is an exceptional one, it shows the potential for female leadership and the societal norms that made it possible. Her ability to manage an entire fleet of people and an estate of land was built upon the same foundational skills you practice every day. You are not just a caretaker. You are an administrator. You are the one who knows which fields are fallow, how much hay is in storage, and whether a cow is sick. These are not minor details. They are the decisions that determine whether your family starves or thrives. And this is why, in the absence of her husband, the Husfrija was the unquestioned authority, and it was a position of power she earned through constant, unwavering labor. In this society where a woman's power was so tangible, it's not surprising that her rights were also legally defined and protected in ways that might seem shockingly modern. You might imagine that in a world of fierce warriors, women would be little more than chattel, but the Norse legal system tells a different story. As you finish your morning chores, you overhear your husband speaking with a neighbor about a local dispute. The conversation turns to an upcoming thing, the local assembly where legal matters are settled. Your ears perk up, as you are not just a silent observer, but a person with a legally recognized voice and a standing in society. The laws, passed down orally and later codified in manuscripts like the Icelandic Gragas, are clear on certain points. For instance, you, as a married woman, have the right to own property. The land, livestock, and other goods you brought into the marriage as a dowry, or that you inherited from your family, remain yours. You can manage them, sell them, or use them as you see fit. This is a far cry from the legal systems of many other parts of medieval Europe, where women's property was often subsumed under their husband's control. The legal record is replete with examples of women using this right to their advantage, engaging in trade, lending money, and even buying their children's freedom if they had been taken as thralls. Even more striking is the right to divorce. While marriage was a strategic alliance between families, it was not an unbreakable bond. A woman could initiate a divorce for specific, legally recognized reasons. A man's inability to perform his marital duties, his physical abuse, or even his public ridicule of his wife were all grounds for separation. A fascinating, if somewhat humorous, example from the sagas illustrates this point. In the saga of Laxdæla, the powerful chieftainess Gurn Osfar's daughter divorces her husband, Orvaldur, because he has sewn a pair of trousers that she found to be unmanly. This may seem trivial to us, but it speaks to a deeper truth about a woman's right to personal dignity and her ability to dissolve a marriage if she felt her honor was being compromised. While we should not take the sagas as pure historical fact, they do reflect a cultural understanding of a woman's agency and a legal system that, at least in theory, supported it. Of course, this is not to say that the system was perfectly egalitarian. A woman's rights were still tied to her family's status and her own reputation. A woman from a powerful clan would have more legal leverage than a woman from a poorer, less influential family. And while she had the right to speak at the thing, her physical presence was not always required. The most influential decisions were still made by men, often in consultation with the women of their family. However, the very existence of these legal protections, from property rights to the ability to divorce, tells us that Viking women were not passive figures. They were considered legal persons with a recognized place in society, and their contributions to the family and the economy were deemed worthy of legal protection. It's a nuance that is often lost in modern portrayals, but it's a crucial one for understanding the true nature of their lives. The farm, for all its busyness and importance, was not the entirety of a Viking woman's world. While your daily tasks keep you rooted to the land, there are moments when the call of the wider world reaches you. Perhaps it's the sight of a longship on the fjord, its single sail a bright patch of color against the gray sky, or the arrival of a merchant carrying goods from a far-off land. While men are often the ones depicted as traders and adventurers, the archaeological record and sagas tell us that women were also active participants in this bustling commercial world. It might surprise you, but you, too, are a merchant. Your trading is likely to be on a smaller scale, at a local market or at a nearby chieftain's hall. You are the one who knows which of the farm's goods are in surplus. The fine cloth you wove, the salted butter you made in the summer, or the extra sheep's wool. You might trade these for tools, for silver arm rings, or for exotic items from abroad. A simple, finely carved comb of bone or a small piece of amber might have come to you through this network of exchange. Archaeologists have found evidence of these trading networks in the form of female burials containing foreign goods, such as beads of glass or carnelian, which were not available in Scandinavia. The presence of these objects suggests that women were either receiving them as gifts or, more likely, acquiring them through their own commercial activities. But some women went far beyond the local market. The sagas, while a source to be used with caution, describe women who traveled and traded alongside their husbands. The famous story of Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, for example, tells of a woman who traveled across the North Atlantic to Greenland and even to the shores of Vinland in modern-day North America. Her saga, Eirik's Saga Raua, describes her as a resilient and resourceful woman, and she is credited with being the first European woman to give birth in the Americas. While her story is exceptional, it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility. The archaeological finds from the Viking settlement at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, for instance, include a spindle whorl, an object used exclusively for spinning thread. This small artifact is a quiet but powerful piece of evidence that women were not just a part of these daring voyages, but were also bringing their vital domestic skills with them, ensuring the survival of these new settlements. So, while your world is centered on the longhouse and the farm, you are not isolated from the great currents of trade and travel that define the Viking Age. The silk thread woven into your brooches, the amber bead on your necklace, or the small coin in your chest. Each one is a small fragment of a story that spans continents. A story that you, as a woman, are an active participant in. It's a perspective that adds another layer of complexity to the image of the stoic Viking woman, revealing her not just as the keeper of the hearth, but as a person with a foot in both the domestic world and the wider, more adventurous world of exploration and commerce. While you might have encountered people from distant lands and traded in goods from across the sea, there were other, less tangible forces that connected the Norse world. The physical journeys of trade and settlement were often guided by the spiritual ones. And in this realm, a different kind of woman held a different kind of power. This was the world of the Volva, the seeress, a woman who walked a path between the seen and the unseen, a figure of immense respect and, at times, profound fear. You might not have been a Volva yourself, but you certainly would have known of one, or even consulted her. Her arrival in your village would have been a significant event, a break in the daily rhythm of farm life, and a quiet, nervous ripple would have spread through the community. You picture her in your mind's eye, a woman, likely older, her face etched with the lines of experience and wisdom. She would be dressed differently from the women of your village, perhaps in a cloak of black or dark blue, with a belt from which hung small leather pouches of herbs and bones. But the most striking object would be her staff, the sea staffer, often of wood or iron, sometimes with an intricate head, its purpose not for walking but for ritual. The staff is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence we have for these figures. Archaeologists have uncovered such staff in a few female graves, the most famous of which is the magnificent Oseberg ship burial in Norway. The woman buried there, who some scholars believe may have been a high priestess or queen, had her body laid out with a beautifully carved staff, among other ritual objects, suggesting she held a position of significant spiritual power. Her power was in her ability to practice seer, a form of Norse sorcery or shamanism. It was a practice almost exclusively the domain of women, and it was considered deeply unmanly for a man to engage in it. There's a certain irony in this, isn't there? The men who prided themselves on their strength and bravery were dependent on the spiritual prowess of women for guidance. They would consult a vulva before a raid, asking if it would be successful, or before a harvest, to divine if it would be bountiful. Her power lay in her ability to scry the future, influence the minds of others, and communicate with spirits. The sagas, while later literary creations, frequently describe these encounters, though often with a degree of suspicion, as the practice of seer was viewed with some ambivalence in a world increasingly influenced by Christian thought. The descriptions of these rituals are vivid, and they often describe a trance-like state, induced by chanting and perhaps even certain herbs. You can almost feel the atmosphere in the hall as she prepared for her ritual. A small, raised platform would be set up, and a small group of women would gather around her, chanting a special song, the Varlikar, to help her enter her trance. The air would grow thick with the scent of burning herbs, and a low, repetitive hum would fill the hall, a sound that would send a shiver down your spine. The vulva would sit on her platform, her head bowed, her staff held in her hands, as she journeyed to the spirit world. The entire community would watch in silent reverence, their future hanging on the words she would speak when she returned. The archaeological evidence from graves, such as the bucket containing what is believed to be cannabis seeds found in the Oseberg burial, suggests that psychoactive plants might have been used to help induce these states. The most famous literary depiction of a vulva is in the Old Norse poem, Völuspá, or the prophecy of the seeress, where a seeress is summoned by Odin himself to recount the history of the world, from its creation to its destruction in Ragnarok. This poem, one of the most important sources of Norse mythology, shows a woman as the sole possessor of this cosmic knowledge. She is the one who holds the keys to the past, present, and future, not the male god of wisdom. This narrative, again, points to the unique and profound spiritual authority held by women in this society, an authority that was respected at the highest levels, even by the gods themselves. So, while men commanded the fields and the seas, it was often women who commanded the forces of fate and destiny. It's a quiet but significant reminder of the dual nature of power in the Norse world, one that was physical and one that was deeply, mysteriously spiritual. After you consider the spiritual power of the vulva, you might find your mind turning to a different kind of female power, one that has captivated modern imagination and been the subject of fierce debate for decades. We are, of course, talking about the Shield Maiden. You've seen her in films and television shows, a beautiful, fierce warrior, sword in hand, charging into battle with a cry on her lips. It's a powerful and compelling image, but what does the historical record actually tell us? The truth, as is so often the case, is more complicated and a good deal more interesting than the simplified myth. So let's ease into this one slowly, shall we? It's a topic that can get a little heated, but we'll stick to the facts as best we can, and acknowledge the places where the facts run out for a long time. The existence of Viking women warriors was largely confined to the sagas and later medieval chronicles. These sources, as we've discussed, are not always a direct reflection of historical reality. They are literary creations, often written down centuries after the events they describe, shaped by the sensibilities and agendas of their authors. One of the most famous accounts comes from the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, who, In his Gesta Danorum from the 12th century, wrote of a shield maiden named Lagertha. He describes her as a skilled and courageous warrior who fought alongside the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. For centuries, this and similar stories were treated with a healthy dose of skepticism by historians. They were seen as literary tropes, fictional characters created to add drama and flair to the stories, perhaps reflecting an idealized, heroic past, but not a true historical reality. It was a common assumption that a woman's place was at home and a man's was on the battlefield, and that the two rarely, if ever, intersected. This was the prevailing scholarly consensus for a very long time. Archaeology seemed to support this view at first. When excavating graves, archaeologists would typically find a woman's burial containing domestic items, keys, spindle whorls, jewelry, while a man's burial would contain weapons, a sword, a shield, an axe. The grave goods were believed to be a direct reflection of the individual's gender and social role. A sword in a grave meant a warrior, and a warrior was a man. It was a simple, elegant conclusion, and it stood for a long time. But as with so many elegant conclusions, it began to fray around the edges. There were always a handful of anomalous graves that contained both female-coded items and weapons, and archaeologists would either dismiss them as outliers or theorize that the weapons were symbolic. A woman, for instance, might have been buried with her husband's sword as a symbol of their shared status, not because she wielded it herself. This was a reasonable, if somewhat unsatisfying, explanation that allowed the simple gendered narrative to hold firm. But then came the science. In 2017, a study was published that shook the academic world. It was about a famous grave from the Viking trading town of Birka in Sweden. The grave, known as BJ 581, was excavated in the 19th century and was long considered the textbook example of a high-status Viking warrior's burial. The person in the grave was laid to rest with a complete set of weapons: a sword, a battle axe, a spear, and a shield. There were also 2 horses and a set of game pieces, suggesting a person of high rank, perhaps a military commander or a tactician. The bones of the skeleton were used for DNA analysis, and the results were unequivocal. The warrior in the grave was genetically female. The news spread like wildfire. The find was a bombshell, seemingly proving that the shield maiden was not a myth at all. However, as a good historian, you must never take one piece of evidence and use it to build a new, simplified narrative. The Birka find is incredibly important, but it doesn't mean that every woman was a warrior or that shield maidens were a common part of everyday life. This woman was likely an extraordinary exception, a person of such unique status and skill that she was accorded a burial typically reserved for male military leaders. The debate now has shifted from did they exist to what was her role. Was she a professional warrior, a military leader, a commander of troops? The DNA can tell us her sex, but it can't tell us how she lived. The find challenges our assumptions about gender roles in Viking society, but it doesn't replace one simple truth with another. It opens up a new world of questions, and that, my friends, is where the real fun of history begins. You find yourself contemplating the image of this woman from Birka, a real historical figure who defied all the neat categories. She was a woman who was buried with a sword, and in that simple fact, a whole universe of possibilities is opened. The image of a warrior woman with a sword might be a fascinating outlier. But you know that for most women in this world, a different kind of strength was required. One that was just as fierce and just as vital to the survival of your people. It was the strength of a mother. The strength to bring new life into a world that was both beautiful and unforgiving. While the tales of a woman on the battlefield are rare and debated, The reality of a woman in childbirth was a common and terrifying truth, a rite of passage that was more likely to be a part of your story than a great raid. You remember the day it happened to you, the sharp pangs, a rhythm of pain that seemed to take over your entire body, a primal dance of life and death. You would have been attended by other women, your mother or an older, experienced neighbor. A community of support gathered around you in the dark, smoky warmth of the longhouse. There was no midwife in the modern sense, but a collective body of wisdom and experience passed down from one generation of women to the next. They would have given you warm water to drink and placed herbs and poultices on your skin to ease the pain, though you knew that the true strength had to come from within. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and the earthy smell of the earthen floor, and the only sounds were the low murmurs of the women and your own ragged breathing. Childbirth was a high-stakes gamble. The mortality rate for both mother and infant was terribly high, a constant shadow that hung over every pregnancy. Life was a fragile thing, and a new life even more so. This is perhaps why rituals were so important. The Norse believed that a person's fate was spun at birth by the Norns, the female weavers of destiny. It was a woman-to-woman transaction with the supernatural world. The mother, in her moment of extreme vulnerability and power, was at the center of this cosmic event, bringing a new person into the world and helping to guide their fate. When the child was finally born, the father would be called in. He would have to perform a ritual to officially accept the child into the family. He would take the newborn and place it on his knee and give it a name. This simple, public act was profoundly significant. It meant he acknowledged the child as his own and that it would be raised as a member of the family. If he refused, the child could be exposed. And this brings us to a difficult and somber subject, the practice of infant exposure, or tbur. While it's hard for us to comprehend now, it was a grim reality in a world of limited resources and harsh winters. If a child was born with a severe deformity, or if the family was too poor to support another mouth, the infant could be left outside to die from the elements or to be found by another. It was a pragmatic and brutal choice, not an act of malice. It was a way of ensuring the survival of the strong at the cost of the weak, a tough but necessary reality in a subsistence society. As Christianity began to take root in the Norse lands, this practice was one of the first things outlawed, a clear sign of the shift in cultural values. Once a child was accepted, the work of raising them began, and it was a responsibility that fell largely to you. There were no schools. Education was practical and hands-on. Your children would learn by your side, watching you as you spun wool, cared for the livestock, and prepared the food. They would learn the stories of their ancestors, the gods, and the sagas. It was through this daily, gentle repetition that the values and skills of your society were passed down. Boys would eventually go to their fathers to learn to fight and farm, but the early years were a time of close, constant maternal guidance. The bond between a mother and her children was the emotional core of the household, the quiet, humming center of a world that was often violent and chaotic. The women who did this work were the architects of the future, shaping the next generation through their love, their labor, and their profound wisdom. The shield maiden may get the headlines, but the mother was, and always has been, the bedrock of civilization. It's a quiet but powerful truth. From the intimate circle of mother and child, our gaze widens to the very foundation of Norse society, the institution of marriage. This wasn't a matter of whispered secrets and moonlit vows. It was a bold, public, and profoundly practical business arrangement. You, as a woman, were a key part of this transaction, not as a passive object to be bartered, but as a valuable asset whose union could forge powerful alliances, cement peace between warring clans, and consolidate land and wealth. While the modern world romanticizes marriage as a union of two individuals in love, in the Viking Age, it was primarily a union of two families. The process was formal and followed a set of deeply ingrained customs. When a man, or more accurately, his family, sought a wife for him, they would approach your family. This was not a quick, casual conversation. It was a negotiation, one that could take weeks or even months. Your father or your male relatives would act as your representatives, but you were not absent from the discussion. Your consent, or at least your public acknowledgement of the arrangement, was legally required. The sagas tell us of women who vocally opposed their arranged marriages, sometimes with disastrous results. But the fact that they could object at all is a testament to their agency. You were the ambassador of your family's honor and a representative of their status. The dowry, known as the munder or hymen filja, was a central part of the negotiation. This was not a payment for you. It was the wealth that you brought with you into the marriage, often consisting of land, livestock, or other goods. What's crucial to understand is that this property remained legally yours. It was not subsumed into your husband's estate. You could manage it, sell it, or pass it on to your own children. This is a point that surprises many, but it is well supported by the legal texts and archaeological evidence. The presence of keys, not just on a mistress's belt, but in her grave, is a physical symbol of her control over the household's material goods, a control that often extended to her own personal property brought from her natal family. The marriage was sealed not with a ring, but with a public feast, the wedding feast, or berkop. This was a joyous and often raucous affair that could last for days. You would be dressed in your finest clothes, your hair adorned with ribbons and beads, as you sat in the center of the hall, surrounded by friends and family. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting meats, wild boar or a whole ox, and the sweet, yeasty scent of mead and ale flowing freely. Musicians would play, and skalds would recite poetry celebrating the union. It was here, in the presence of the entire community, that the legal contract was made, not through a simple ceremony, but through a series of rituals and formal exchanges. The feasting, the drinking, the celebration, it all served a practical purpose. It was a public display of the new alliance, a way of signaling to all that these two families were now bound together. A new unit of power and influence. The bond between husband and wife was one of mutual respect and shared responsibility. While the man was the head of the family in public life and the world of politics and war, you, the wife, were the undisputed master of the household. Your realms of power were complementary. He might have been a great chieftain, but without you to manage the farm, oversee the thralls, and ensure the prosperity of the household, his power would have no foundation. The sagas, for all their focus on heroic deeds, often show us this reality. We see the powerful female figures behind the scenes, making decisions that affect entire family lines. This partnership was a matter of survival, and it created a relationship built on trust and a deep understanding of each other's roles. The idea that marriage was not about love can feel cold to us now, but it's important to remember that love and affection often grew from this foundation of shared purpose. You would be partners in life, in raising a family, and in building a legacy. It was a serious, lifelong commitment, and you were not a passive participant, but an active and vital co-creator of your family's destiny. After a life of hard work, of raising children, of managing the household and the farm, there comes a time for the final rest. While we might look at a Viking life and see only hardship, death was not necessarily viewed with fear, but as a journey to a new place. And just as your life was a testament to your power and status, so too would your death be. Your funeral, and the items you were buried with, were the final, physical statement of who you were and what you contributed to your society. You find yourself thinking about this as you quietly, gently, wrap an elderly relative's body in a clean linen shroud. The air is still, save for the soft rustle of the fabric and the hushed whispers of the other women in the hall. The preparation of the body was a task for women. It was a solemn, respectful ritual, a final act of care for a person who had lived a full life. The body would be cleaned and dressed in its finest clothes, adorned with the jewelry and brooches that she wore in life, the very same ones that held her clothes together and signified her status. These items, as we've learned, were not just for show. They were a part of her very identity, and they would accompany her to the grave. The archaeological record is a treasure trove of these final statements. We have found women buried with their keys, their spindle whorls, and their loom weights, the silent testimony to their role as the husfrige, the mistress of the house. In a sense, they took their authority with them, a final, poignant nod to the power they wielded in life. The form of your burial would depend on your status and the traditions of your region. If you were a person of wealth and high standing, you might be buried in a ship, a symbolic vessel for your final journey. The Oseberg ship burial is the most famous example of this. Two women, one old and one younger, were laid to rest in a magnificently carved ship, with an entire household's worth of grave goods, a cart, sledges, beds, kitchen utensils, and a vast collection of textiles. The sheer extravagance of the burial suggests they were women of immense power, perhaps priestesses or queens, and the presence of so many domestic items tells us that even in death, a woman's identity was tied to her role as the keeper of the home. This burial challenges the notion that women were not as respected as men. Their graves, in many cases, were just as lavish and complex. For a woman of lesser status, the burial might be simpler, but no less meaningful. She might be laid to rest in a simple wooden coffin in an earthen mound, or her body might be placed on a pyre and cremated, the ashes then placed in an urn or scattered. The choice between cremation and inhumation seems to have varied by region and era, but both were common practices. The sensory experience of a cremation would be profoundly different from a burial. The heat, the smell of burning wood, the sight of the pyre reaching to the sky. It would be a dramatic and final farewell. The sagas sometimes speak of these funeral pyres, and they describe the grave goods being placed on the fire to accompany the deceased to the next life. The items placed with the body, the grave goods, were meant to provide for the deceased in the afterlife. They were provisions for the journey and the final dwelling. It wasn't just about what you owned, but what you needed. Your knife, your comb, your keys. They were not just possessions, but extensions of your living self. For a powerful woman, a final burial was a chance to make a definitive statement about her life. The Burka warrior, for instance, was buried not only with weapons, but with the game pieces, the signs of a tactician, and with a horse, the sign of a person of high status. Her burial was a deliberate and public declaration of her unique identity, a statement that was meant to last for eternity. The silent language of the grave, that cool, quiet earth, tells us more about the real lives of Viking women than all the sagas combined. It is a story told in brooches, in keys, in spindle whorls, and in the occasional sword. And it is a story that, in its quiet finality, speaks of a power that endured even after life was over. If a burial mound was the final, quiet home for the deceased, a runestone was a public declaration to the world, a permanent marker of a person's life and legacy, carved in stone for all to see. From the private world of the grave, we emerge into the public, where a woman's importance was not only recognized, but proudly proclaimed. You find yourself standing in a field, the wind cool on your face, looking at a large, upright stone. It is covered in intricate carvings, a swirling serpentine beast, and within its coils, a series of etched lines, the runes. You run your hand over the cool, hard surface, feeling the precise work of the chisel that brought these words to life. The runestone is the ultimate family photo, a permanent record of who you were and what your family thought of you. While many of the most famous runestones commemorate men, the great warriors or explorers who died in far-off lands, a significant number, a surprisingly high number for the time, are dedicated to women. This simple fact is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence we have for a woman's public status and social importance. She was not just a side note in her husband's or son's story. She was a central figure, important enough to be etched in stone for all eternity. The runestones were not just memorials. They were public statements of family honor and lineage, and the women within those families were the threads that held it all together. The inscriptions are often brief but powerful. They will say something like, Ra had this stone raised in memory of her husband. A with a Qtestdrr, the wife of Ragnvald, the mother of Asbjorn. In a few short words, a woman's entire social identity is laid bare. We see her as a wife, a mother, and a person with the wealth and influence to commission a monument. Some inscriptions are even more revealing. A famous runestone from Uppland, in Sweden, tells of a woman named Jarlabank who had a bridge and a road built in honor of her husband. Her name is etched on the stone, and it says she was a good builder. This is a quiet but profound detail, isn't it? It tells us that women were not only the beneficiaries of these monuments, but also the ones who commissioned and financed them, using their wealth to create public works. Even more intriguing are the inscriptions that refer to women as Jefna, a term that means giver or benefactor. This suggests a woman of such high status and wealth that she was a patron, a person who used her resources to support her community or her family. These runestones tell us of women who managed estates, who held a prominent place in their community, and whose power was acknowledged and respected in a very public way. The fact that a family would pay a skilled carver to etch their mother's or wife's name into a stone, for a legacy that would outlast them all, speaks volumes about the value placed on a woman's life and her contributions, of course. We must be careful not to generalize too much from this. The people who could afford to commission a runestone were almost certainly from the wealthy elite. We have no runestones for the common farmer's wife or the thrall. These stones tell us the story of the powerful, not the average. But even so, they give us a glimpse of a society where women were not invisible. They were public figures, their lives and deeds worthy of commemoration. You find yourself contemplating this, the simple, quiet permanence of it all. In an age of fleeting raids and temporary conquests, these stones were a statement of a more enduring power, a power rooted in family, honor, and the steadfast, unyielding strength of a life lived well. The runestone, that cold, hard rock, is a warm testament to a woman's enduring legacy, while the runestones tell a story of a rooted society, of a legacy carved into the very earth of the homeland. Many Viking women's stories were not told in stone, but in the journey itself. You find yourself leaving the solid ground of the homestead behind. The sound of a longship's oars cutting through the water, the creak of the mast, and the constant, rhythmic rocking of the waves become the soundtrack of your life. You are a settler, a pioneer, journeying with your family not for a short raid, but to a new land, a blank slate where a new life must be built from the ground up. This was the reality for a great many Viking women, and their experiences were different, and in many ways even more challenging, than those of the women who stayed behind. The journey itself was arduous. You would have been packed tightly on the ship, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, salt, and unwashed bodies. You might have brought with you your most precious possessions, your keys, a chest of clothes, and the tools of your trade, your spindle whorls and loom weights. For you knew that the first order of business in a new place would be to establish a household, and that meant making cloth. The sagas, particularly those from Iceland, describe women like Gurn Osfarsdottir who, after facing a life of personal drama and tragedy, took a ship and journeyed to Rome. While her journey might have been for pilgrimage, it illustrates that women were not just passive passengers. They were active participants in these voyages, with their own goals and their own destinies to forge. Archaeological finds from Norse settlements in places like Greenland and Vinland, Lance aux Meadows, confirm the presence of women through the discovery of female-coded objects, like spindle whorls. This small artifact is a giant piece of evidence. Upon arrival, the work would have been relentless. You would have been faced with a new and often hostile environment. In Iceland, you had to contend with volcanic rock and a harsh climate. In Greenland, the short growing season and lack of wood meant a constant struggle for survival. And in the British Isles, you would be settling among a native population that might not welcome you. The foundational work of a woman, as the keeper of the home and the administrator of the farm, was even more vital in these new, precarious settlements. Without a woman's ability to preserve food, manage resources, and create textiles, the settlement would simply fail. The sagas are full of stories of resourceful women who were the backbone of these new colonies, their quiet labor ensuring the survival of their people. And in these new lands, a fascinating cultural exchange took place. You would have encountered people with different languages, different customs, and different beliefs. Viking women who settled in Ireland or England would have married into local families, their Norse traditions blending with the local ones. Archaeological evidence from these settlements often shows a mix of Viking and local artifacts in graves. A woman might be buried in a Viking-style brooch, but with a local-style clasp, or with beads from her new home country. This subtle blending of material culture is a testament to the quiet, everyday integration that was happening on the ground. The story of the Viking Age is not just one of Norse expansion. It's one of cultural fusion, and women were the primary agents of this change. Consider the fate of the Greenlandic Norse settlement, for instance. Historians and archaeologists debate why it failed. But one theory is that the settlers' reliance on Old World customs, their refusal to fully adopt the hunting practices and technologies of the local Inuit, led to their eventual demise. And it was a failure that was felt most keenly by the women, who were responsible for the day-to-day survival of the household. Their inability to adapt to the new, colder environment, in terms of farming and resources, was likely a significant factor in the collapse. This stands in stark contrast to the success of the settlers in Iceland, where women are depicted in the sagas as being deeply resourceful and adaptable. The story of the Viking woman abroad is a complex one, a narrative of triumph, tragedy, and quiet, unrelenting resilience. She was a co-pioneer, a co-founder, and a co-creator of a new world. And her story is just as important as the one of the men who sailed the ship to get there. After journeying with me through the Longhouse, the trading markets, the spiritual world of the vulva, and the far-flung settlements, you now have a much more complete picture of what life was really like for a Viking woman. It is a story that is far richer, more complex, and ultimately more truthful than the one you might have absorbed from popular media. And so, for this section, we'll take a moment to gently, and with a bit of a sigh, debunk some of the common misconceptions that stand in the way of a nuanced understanding. This is where the historian in me gets a little prickly, so please, bear with me. The modern image of the Viking woman is often a two-sided caricature. On one side, we have the passive, beautiful maiden, perhaps a princess waiting to be rescued or a simple housewife waiting for her man to return from a raid. On the other, we have the hyper-masculine shield maiden, clad in leather armor, a sword in each hand, a battle cry on her lips as she cleaves through a line of enemies. Both of these images, while fun to watch on screen, are fundamentally ahistorical. They simplify a complex reality into a single, sensationalized trope. And in doing so, they miss the true source of a Viking woman's power. Let's take a moment to recall the things we have learned. The woman was not a passive figure. She was the keeper of the keys, the master of the household. Her power was domestic, but it was immense. It was rooted in her control over the family's survival. She owned property, she could inherit, and she could initiate a divorce. This legal standing, this recognition of her as a legal person, is a far more powerful and lasting truth than any romanticized image of a woman on the battlefield. While the modern world might find it hard to see power in a spindle or a key, the Viking world saw them as tangible symbols of authority and the foundation of all wealth. And what about the Shield Maiden? While the Burka warrior grave is a fascinating and important piece of evidence, it doesn't change the fact that for the vast majority of Viking women, life was not spent on the battlefield. It was spent weaving cloth, preserving food, managing livestock, and raising children. The strength of a mother, who brought a new life into a difficult world and nurtured it to adulthood, was a daily, constant, and unyielding form of power. It's a quiet strength, one that doesn't lend itself to dramatic television scenes, but it was the strength that built and sustained an entire civilization. The Burka warrior was a fascinating and compelling outlier, but the Husfrija was the rule. And we do a disservice to the vast majority of Viking women by forgetting this. The story of the Viking woman is a story of quiet resilience and unglamorous labor. It's a story of adaptability, of women who took their culture with them to new lands and helped to forge new ones. It's a story told in the silent testimony of grave goods and the brief, etched words on a runestone. It's a story of a society that, for all its brutality and violence, held a deep respect for women's roles and a recognition of their legal rights. The sensationalized images of today are fun, but they are flat. They lack the depth, the texture, and the rich, complex reality of a life that was filled with both immense hardship and a remarkable degree of agency. So, as we begin to wind down our journey, I ask you to forget the television shows and the video games for a moment. Instead, imagine yourself back in that longhouse. You hear the rhythmic slap of the loom, you feel the weight of the keys on your belt, and you smell the familiar scent of wood smoke and wool. This is the real story. It's not one of a single warrior or a single maiden. It's the story of 1,000 generations of women who, through their quiet, relentless labor, held an entire society together. And in its own gentle, unassuming way, that story is more heroic than any myth. The story of the Viking woman, then, is not one of a singular hero, but of 1,000 quiet heroes whose lives, though different, were all bound by a common thread of immense strength and enduring resilience. As our journey through time comes to its gentle close, let's take a final moment to reflect on all the layers we have uncovered, all the subtle truths that lie beneath the surface of the grand sagas and the popular myths. We began in the warmth of the longhouse, the smoky heart of the home where your power resided, where you held the keys to the very survival of your family. You were the Husfrija, the undisputed master of the domestic realm, a position of authority and immense trust, a fact confirmed by the keys found in the graves of women of every status. We trace the threads of your influence, from the wool you spun and the va with a qtame with a qtel you wove, transforming raw material into the most important form of currency, to the vast administrative responsibilities of running a farm, a complex system of livestock, food preservation, and labor management. Your hands, we realized, were not just skilled. They were creating the economic engine of your entire family. Then, we looked at the legal documents and found something surprising: a society that, for all its patriarchal structures, gave women the right to own property, inherit wealth, and even divorce a husband. We saw the exceptional power of the vulva, a spiritual leader who commanded respect from the mightiest chieftains, a woman who controlled the unseen forces of fate, whose knowledge was so vast that even Odin himself sought her wisdom. And, of course, we acknowledged the compelling mystery of the Shield Maiden, the rare, remarkable woman who may have held a sword in her hand, a reminder that the world was more complex than our simple categories would allow. But we also recognized that for most, the true battlefield was childbirth, the terrifying but vital process of bringing new life into the world, a woman's role as the foundation of the future. We learned that a marriage was not just a matter of love, but a strategic alliance, a bond of partnership and mutual respect, a way of linking families and consolidating power. And finally, we saw how a woman's life was publicly and permanently memorialized, not just in the objects she took with her to the grave, but in the enduring words etched on a runestone, a testament to her importance in the lineage of her clan. We sailed with you to new lands, and we saw how you adapted, how your quiet labor ensured the survival of new settlements, and how your culture subtly merged with others. And in the end, we looked back at all the modern misconceptions, the flat caricatures that miss the true, quiet heroism of these lives. Your story, the real story, is not one of loud, violent heroics, but of a strength that was unyielding, constant, and utterly essential. It is a story of quiet resilience, of 1,000 small victories won in the home, on the farm, and in the heart of the family. The fire is now just a warm glow in the center of the hall, the crackle and pop giving way to a soft, consistent hum. The day's work is done, and the longhouse is slowly falling silent. The low breathing of your family fills the air, a gentle rhythm that has been a constant in this world for centuries. You can feel the quiet peace of the coming night, the deep rest that is earned after a long day of labor and life. The cool night air whispers through a small gap in the roof, a soft, soothing presence. Let your mind drift now. Let the images of the past, the weaving loom, the heavy key, the silent, upright stone, recede into the quiet darkness. The story is told. The memory is safe. There is nothing left to do now but to rest. Close your eyes and let the gentle hum of history lull you into a peaceful slumber. The past is always there, waiting patiently for us. But for now, the journey is over. The work is done. Sweet dreams.